Picture this. It's 1912, and the world is buzzing with excitement about the most magnificent ship ever built. Not just any ship, mind you, but a floating palace that would make even the gods of the sea jealous. This is the story of RMS Titanic, a tale so incredible, so tragic, and so utterly human that it continues to captivate us more than a century later. Grab a cup of tea, preferably not served on fine china that might end up at the bottom of the ocean, and let me tell you the most extraordinary maritime story ever told. Our story begins not with the ship itself, but with three men whose ambitions were as vast as the Atlantic Ocean they sought to conquer. In the smoke-filled gentlemen's clubs of London, where the air was thick with cigar smoke and even thicker with British confidence, a plan was hatched that would change maritime history forever. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, was a man with a problem. His company's ships were being outclassed by their German rivals, particularly the Hamburg America Line, whose ships were not only faster, but also more luxurious. Ismay was the kind of man who couldn't stand being second best at anything. The type who would probably challenge his own shadow to a duel if it dared to be longer than him. One evening in 1907, at the London home of Lord Purry, the chairman of Harland and Wolff Shipbuilders, Ismay found himself in deep conversation with his host. Purry was a Belfast man with the kind of engineering mind that could look at a pile of steel and see a floating city. As they sat in Peary's study, surrounded by ship blueprints and maritime charts, these two titans of industry began sketching out what would become the most famous ships in history. What if, Ismay mused, swirling his brandy, we couldn't beat them on speed, but we could absolutely crush them on size and luxury. Peary's eyes lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. You mean build ships so magnificent, so utterly spectacular, that speed becomes irrelevant. And thus the Olympic-class ships were conceived, three sisters that would dominate the North Atlantic: Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. But it was the middle sister, Titanic, that would capture the world's imagination and, tragically, break its heart. The third man in this triumvirate of ambition was Thomas Andrews, Peary's nephew and the chief naval architect at Harland and Wolff. Andrews was a perfectionist of the highest order, the kind of man who would redesign a doorknob 17 times to make it 2% more efficient. He was also, by all accounts, a genuinely lovely human being, which, as we'll see, makes his fate all the more poignant. Andrews threw himself into designing Titanic with the passion of Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, except instead of angels, he was creating floating luxury. Every rivet, every beam, every piece of decorative molding was carefully considered. He didn't just want to build a ship. He wanted to build a masterpiece. The construction of Titanic began on March 31st, 1909, at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. If you've ever wondered what it sounds like when 15,000 men are simultaneously hammering, riveting, welding, and generally making an enormous racket, well, Belfast in 1909 would have been your paradise. The noise was so constant that local birds reportedly learned to tweet in rhythm with the hammering, though that might be a slight exaggeration. The ship that slowly took shape was nothing short of revolutionary. At 882 feet long and 175 feet high, Titanic was not just big. She was monumentally, spectacularly, almost ridiculously big. To put this in perspective, if you stood her on end, she would have been taller than most skyscrapers of the time. She was so large that when workers first saw the completed hull, several reportedly got dizzy just looking up at it. But size was just the beginning. Titanic was designed to be the most luxurious ship ever built, a floating embodiment of Edwardian elegance and technological prowess. The first-class accommodations were so opulent, they made five-star hotels look like youth hostels. The ship featured a grand staircase that was essentially a work of art, a sweeping, ornate masterpiece topped with a glass dome that bathed everything in natural light. It was the kind of staircase that made you want to descend it dramatically, preferably while wearing an elaborate gown and a tiara. The first-class dining saloon could seat 554 people and was decorated in the style of a Jacobean manor house, complete with elaborate wood paneling and crystal chandeliers. The A la Carte restaurant was managed by Luigi Gatti, who had been poached from the Ritz Hotel in London. Gatti was so confident in his culinary skills that he reportedly declared he could make even hardtack taste like a delicacy, a boast that, thankfully, was never put to the test. For those who preferred their relaxation with a side of chlorine, Titanic featured a swimming pool, a novelty so rare on ships that many passengers had never seen one before. The pool was located on F deck and was filled with heated seawater. It was the kind of amenity that made passengers feel like they were staying at the finest resort, except this resort happened to be moving at 23 knots across the Atlantic. The ship also boasted a gymnasium equipped with the latest exercise equipment, including rowing machines, stationary bikes, and electric horses. Yes, electric horses. These were mechanical contraptions designed to simulate horseback riding, because apparently, even in 1912, people were inventing bizarre exercise equipment. The gym instructor, T.W. Macaulay, was so enthusiastic about fitness that he probably would have organized aerobics classes on the deck if given the chance. For the gentlemen, there was a smoking room decorated in Georgian style, where they could retreat to discuss business, politics, and whatever else Edwardian gentlemen discussed while puffing on cigars. The room featured leather chairs so comfortable that several passengers reportedly fell asleep in them and had to be gently awakened by stewards. The ladies had their own retreat in the form of a reading and writing room, decorated in white with delicate furniture and large windows overlooking the sea. It was designed to be a peaceful sanctuary where women could write letters, read books, or simply contemplate the vastness of the ocean, though hopefully not too contemplatively, given what was to come. But Titanic wasn't just about luxury. She was also a marvel of engineering and safety. The ship was divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by bulkheads that could be closed at the flip of a switch from the bridge. The designers calculated that even if the 4 largest compartments were flooded, the ship would still remain afloat. This led to Titanic being dubbed practically unsinkable by the shipbuilding magazine The Shipbuilder, a phrase that would later be shortened to unsinkable by the press and become one of history's most tragic examples of tempting fate. The ship's propulsion system was equally impressive. Titanic was powered by a combination of reciprocating engines and a low-pressure turbine, generating a total of 30,000 horsepower. To put this in perspective, that's enough power to run a small city, or, as one engineer joked, enough to power every electric horse in the gymnasium simultaneously. The wireless telegraph system was state-of-the-art, with a range of 500 miles during the day and up to 2,000 miles at night. The system was operated by Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, 2 young men from the Marconi Company who took their job seriously. Perhaps too seriously, as we'll discover. As construction neared completion, the excitement surrounding Titanic reached fever pitch. The press dubbed her the Ship of Dreams, and tickets for the maiden voyage became the hottest commodity in high society. Everyone who was anyone wanted to be aboard for this historic journey. The ship's maiden voyage was scheduled for April 10, 1912, sailing from Southampton to New York. The passenger list read like a who's who of early 20th century society. There was John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in America, traveling with his pregnant wife Madeline. Astor was so wealthy that he once joked he could buy the ship if he liked it enough, a comment that would prove tragically ironic. Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining heir, was aboard with his valet and chauffeur. Guggenheim was known for his impeccable dress sense, and once claimed he had never worn the same outfit twice, a habit that would take on poignant significance during the disaster. Isidore and Ida Strauss, the owners of Macy's department store, were returning from a European vacation. The elderly couple was so devoted to each other that they were rarely seen apart, leading fellow passengers to joke that they were attached at the hip, a bond that would prove unbreakable even in the face of death. Margaret Molly Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, was a Colorado socialite with a personality as large as her fortune. Brown was the kind of woman who could charm a snake, and probably had at some point. She was traveling alone, having just visited her daughter in Paris, and was eager to return to her beloved Colorado. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was aboard for the maiden voyage to observe how his creation performed and to make notes for improvements on Britannic, the third sister ship. Andrews was like a proud father watching his child take their first steps, except his child was 46,000 tons and could carry 3,500 people. Captain Edward Smith was chosen to command Titanic on her maiden voyage. Smith was the White Star Line's most senior captain, known as the Millionaire's Captain, because wealthy passengers specifically requested to sail with him. At 62, Smith was planning to retire after this voyage, making Titanic his swan song. He was the kind of captain who inspired confidence just by walking onto the bridge tall, distinguished, with a white beard that made him look like a maritime Santa Claus. Smith had commanded ships for over 40 years and had never had a serious accident. His safety record was so impeccable that he once joked that he couldn't imagine any condition that would cause a ship to founder in modern times. "I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel," he said. "Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." These words would haunt maritime history. The crew of Titanic was a mix of experienced seamen and newcomers, eager to work on the world's most famous ship. Chief Officer Henry Wilde had been transferred from Olympic specifically for the maiden voyage. First Officer William Murdoch was known for his quick thinking and steady nerves. Sixth Officer James Moody, at just 24, was the youngest officer aboard and was so excited about the voyage that he wrote to his family describing Titanic as a marvel. The ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, was comprised of 8 talented musicians who were technically employees of an agency rather than White Star Line, but they were an integral part of the ship's atmosphere. Hartley was a devout Methodist who believed music could lift spirits in any situation, a belief that would be put to the ultimate test. On the morning of April 10, 1912, Southampton was buzzing with excitement. Crowds gathered at the docks to witness the departure of the world's largest ship. Titanic sat at her berth like a sleeping giant, her 4 massive funnels reaching toward the sky. Only 3 of the funnels were functional. The 4th was added for aesthetic purposes, because the designers thought 4 looked more impressive than 3. It was the maritime equivalent of a fake pocket on a jacket, but it certainly looked magnificent. The boarding process was a spectacle in itself. First-class passengers arrived in chauffeur-driven automobiles, their luggage handled by an army of porters. Second-class passengers, mostly middle-class professionals and clergy, boarded with a sense of excitement and pride at traveling on such a magnificent vessel. Third-class passengers, many of them immigrants seeking a new life in America, looked up at the towering ship with wonder and hope. Among the third-class passengers were entire families carrying everything they owned in a few suitcases. There was the Sage family, John and Annie Sage with their 9 children, all immigrating from England to Florida. The children ranged in age from 4 to 20, and they were so excited about the journey that they spent the first day exploring every inch of the ship they were allowed to access. The Anderson family from Sweden was traveling to Canada with their 5 children. The youngest, Sigrid, was just 4 years old and had never seen a ship before. She reportedly spent the first hour of the voyage asking her parents if they were really floating on water, because it didn't feel like it. As noon approached, the departure preparations reached their climax. The ship's whistle sounded 3 times, a sound so deep and powerful that it could be heard for miles. Windows in Southampton reportedly rattled from the vibration. Captain Smith gave the order to cast off, and slowly, majestically, Titanic began to move. But the departure almost ended in disaster before it began. As Titanic pulled away from her berth, the suction from her massive propellers caused the nearby ship New York to break free from her moorings and drift toward Titanic. For several tense minutes, it looked like the maiden voyage might end before it started, with a collision right in Southampton harbor. Quick thinking by the tugboat crews and some skillful maneuvering by Captain Smith averted disaster. But it was an ominous beginning to what was supposed to be a triumphant journey. "Well," joked one passenger as they watched the near miss, "at least we know the ship can stop quickly if needed." The irony of this comment would become apparent 4 days later. Once clear of Southampton, Titanic made brief stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, now Cove, Ireland, to pick up additional passengers. The stop in Queenstown was particularly poignant, as it was the last time Titanic would touch land. Many of the Irish passengers boarding there were immigrants leaving their homeland forever, carrying dreams of a better life in America. Among those boarding at Queenstown was Eugene Daly, a young man from County Galway who had saved for years to afford the passage. Daly brought his baggage pipes aboard and entertained fellow third-class passengers with traditional Irish music. His playing was so popular that even some first-class passengers came down to listen, creating one of those magical moments where class distinctions temporarily disappeared in the face of beautiful music. As Titanic left Queenstown and headed into the open Atlantic, the ship settled into the rhythm of ocean travel. The weather was perfect: calm seas, clear skies, and mild temperatures. Passengers quickly adapted to shipboard life, establishing routines and forming friendships that would, in many cases, last for the rest of their lives, however long that might be. The first-class passengers lived like royalty. They dined on elaborate multi-course meals prepared by French chefs, sipped champagne in elegant lounges, and strolled the promenade decks while discussing the latest fashions and political developments. The men gathered in the smoking room to play cards and discuss business deals, while the ladies met in the reading room to exchange gossip and plan their New York social calendars. John Jacob Astor IV spent much of his time in the smoking room, regaling fellow passengers with stories of his various business ventures. Astor had made his fortune in real estate and had recently returned from his honeymoon in Egypt with his much younger second wife, Madeline. The couple had faced considerable scandal due to their age difference and the circumstances of Astor's divorce. But aboard Titanic, they seemed happy and relaxed. Benjamin Guggenheim was often seen in the first-class lounge, impeccably dressed and charming everyone he met. Guggenheim had a reputation as something of a playboy, but he was also genuinely interested in people and had a gift for making others feel important. He spent hours talking with fellow passengers about everything from art to politics to the latest technological innovations. The Widner family from Philadelphia was traveling with a priceless collection of books, including a rare edition of Francis Bacon's essays that Harry Widner had purchased in London. Harry was a bibliophile who dreamed of building one of the world's great libraries, and he spent much of the voyage cataloging his purchases and planning how to display them in his family's mansion. In second class, the atmosphere was more relaxed, but no less enjoyable. The accommodations were comfortable, the food was excellent, and the passengers were a diverse mix of professionals, clergy, and middle-class families. Father Thomas Biles, a Catholic priest, held daily services and was beloved by passengers of all faiths for his kindness and wisdom. Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher and journalist, spent his time observing everything around him and taking detailed notes. Beasley was fascinated by the ship's technology and spent hours talking with crew members about how everything worked. His curiosity and attention to detail would later make him one of the most reliable witnesses to the disaster. Third-class passengers made their own entertainment. The general room became a gathering place where people from dozens of countries shared stories, songs, and dreams. Despite the language barriers, friendships formed quickly. Children played games on deck while their parents watched and planned for their new lives in America. The Sage family had claimed a corner of the third-class general room as their unofficial headquarters. With 9 children ranging from toddlers to young adults, they were impossible to miss. The older children helped translate for passengers who spoke little English, while the younger ones entertained everyone with their endless energy and curiosity. Annie Sage, the mother, became something of a den mother to the other families, offering advice and comfort to nervous first-time travelers. The ship's daily routine was as precise as clockwork. Each morning, passengers woke to the gentle vibration of the engines and the sound of stewards preparing for the day. Breakfast was served in the various dining rooms according to class, with first-class passengers enjoying elaborate spreads of fresh fruit, pastries, and made-to-order eggs, while third-class passengers received hearty but simple fare of porridge, bread, and tea. The ship's newspaper, the Atlantic Daily Bulletin, was published each morning and distributed to passengers. It contained news received by wireless from around the world, ship's announcements, and social notes about passenger activities. Reading the bulletin became a morning ritual for many passengers, their connection to the world they had left behind. Captain Smith maintained his reputation as the perfect host, making regular appearances in the first-class areas to chat with passengers and ensure their comfort. He was particularly attentive to the ladies, offering his arm for walks around the deck and sharing stories of his long career at sea. Smith had a gift for making each passenger feel like they were his personal guest, rather than just another fare-paying customer. The ship's officers were equally professional and courteous. First Officer Murdoch was often seen on the bridge, his keen eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He had a reputation for being able to spot other ships long before anyone else, a skill that had served him well throughout his career. Chief Officer Wilde, though new to Titanic, quickly adapted to the ship's routines and was respected by both crew and passengers for his calm competence. Thomas Andrews was everywhere at once, notebook in hand, observing how his creation performed in real-world conditions. He timed how long it took stewards to serve meals, measured the vibration levels in different parts of the ship, and interviewed passengers about their comfort. Andrews was the kind of perfectionist who noticed that a door handle was positioned 2 inches too high, or that a particular corridor was slightly too narrow for 2 people to pass comfortably. "Mr. Andrews," one passenger joked, "you're going to wear out your pencil before we reach New York." Andrews smiled and replied, "Better to wear out pencils than to have passengers uncomfortable. Every detail matters when you're trying to build the perfect ship." The ship's band provided a constant soundtrack to the voyage. Wallace Hartley had assembled a group of talented musicians who could play everything from classical pieces to popular dance tunes. They'd perform during meals, in the lounges, and on deck during pleasant weather. Their music became the heartbeat of the ship, setting the mood for romance, relaxation, and celebration. The gymnasium was a popular attraction, particularly among the men. T.W. Macaulay, the instructor, was a fitness enthusiast who believed that ocean travel was the perfect time to improve one's physical condition. He organized group exercises and gave individual instruction on the various machines. The electric horses were particularly popular, though several passengers admitted they felt rather silly bouncing up and down on mechanical steeds while crossing the Atlantic. The swimming pool was another marvel that drew curious passengers. Many had never seen a pool on a ship before, and the idea of swimming while traveling at sea seemed almost magical. The pool was small by modern standards, but it was kept scrupulously clean and heated to a comfortable temperature. Swimming lessons were offered for those who had never learned, and several passengers took advantage of the opportunity. The ship's library was a quiet refuge filled with books in multiple languages. Passengers could borrow novels, reference books, and magazines, or simply sit in the comfortable chairs and read while watching the ocean through the large windows. The librarian, a scholarly gentleman named Mr. Hutchinson, was always ready with recommendations and seemed to have read every book in the collection. For those seeking spiritual comfort, Religious services were held regularly. Father Biles conducted Catholic masses, while Protestant services were led by various clergy among the passengers. These services were well attended and provided a sense of community and continuity for passengers far from their home churches. The children aboard Titanic were having the adventure of their lives. The ship was like a floating playground, with long corridors to explore, decks to run on, and endless nooks and crannies to investigate. The crew was generally tolerant of their curiosity, and many officers and stewards became unofficial babysitters, telling stories and showing the children how various parts of the ship worked. Lorraine Allison, a 2-year-old traveling first class with her parents, became something of a ship's mascot. She had no fear of anyone and would toddle up to complete strangers with a smile that could melt the coldest heart. The crew spoiled her terribly, and she could often be found in the galley helping the chefs or on the bridge assisting the officers. The Navertil boys, Michelle and Edmund, were traveling under assumed names with their father, who had essentially kidnapped them from their mother in France. The boys, aged 4 and 2, spoke only French and were confused by their situation, but they were charmed by the ship and the attention they received from other passengers. Their father, traveling as Louis Hoffman, was torn between guilt over his actions and joy at having his sons with him. As the days passed, the ship settled into a comfortable routine. Passengers formed friendships, romances bloomed, and everyone seemed to be enjoying the voyage immensely. The weather remained perfect, with calm seas and clear skies that allowed for spectacular sunsets and star-filled nights. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were kept busy with passenger messages. In 1912, wireless communication was still relatively new and exciting, and many passengers wanted to send messages to friends and family just for the novelty of communicating from the middle of the ocean. Phillips and Bride worked in shifts around the clock, tapping out messages in Morse code and receiving replies from shore stations and other ships. The messages ranged from the mundane to the romantic. Business deals were conducted, family news was shared, and love letters were sent across the waves. One passenger sent a message to his wife saying, "Having wonderful time. Ship is magnificent. Wish you were here." Another sent a business telegram that simply read, "Deal approved. Proceed with purchase." The wireless room was like the nerve center of a floating city, connecting Titanic to the rest of the world. But not all the messages were personal. The wireless operators also received official communications, including weather reports and ice warnings from other ships. These warnings were routine during April crossings of the North Atlantic, as the ice season was at its peak. Ships regularly reported ice sightings to help other vessels navigate safely through the dangerous waters. On April 12th, the French liner La Touraine reported icebergs and field ice in the area Titanic would be crossing. On April 13th, the German ship America reported passing 2 large icebergs. The Greek steamer Athenae reported ice and bergs in the same general area. These warnings were received and noted, but they were considered routine information rather than urgent alerts. Captain Smith was well aware of the ice conditions. He had been crossing the North Atlantic for decades and knew that April was always a dangerous month for ice. However, the weather conditions were so perfect, clear skies, calm seas, excellent visibility, that the ice threat seemed manageable. The standard procedure was to maintain course and speed while posting extra lookouts and remaining vigilant. The ship's lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were experienced seamen who took their duties seriously. They were stationed in the Crow's Nest, a small platform high on the forward mast, where they had an excellent view of the sea ahead. Their job was to watch for other ships, obstacles, and anything else that might pose a danger to Titanic. The lookouts had requested binoculars for their watch, but none were available. The binoculars that had been assigned to the Crow's Nest were locked in a cabinet, and the officer who had the key had been transferred off the ship at the last minute. This seemingly minor oversight would later be cited as a contributing factor to the disaster, though whether binoculars would have made a difference remains a matter of debate among maritime historians. As April 14th dawned, Titanic was making excellent time across the Atlantic. The ship had covered 546 miles in the previous 24 hours, and Captain Smith was pleased with her performance. The weather remained perfect, with calm seas and clear skies that stretched to the horizon in every direction. It was the kind of day that made ocean travel seem like the most pleasant way to journey between continents. The passengers went about their usual routines, unaware that this would be their last full day aboard the ship. In first class, the Astors enjoyed a leisurely breakfast while discussing their plans for New York. Benjamin Guggenheim spent the morning writing letters in the lounge, his elegant handwriting flowing across expensive stationery. The Widners were in the library, with Harry cataloging his book purchases and planning how to transport them safely to Philadelphia. In second class, Lawrence Beasley was on deck taking photographs and making notes about the ship's construction and operation. Father Biles was preparing for the evening service, selecting hymns and preparing a sermon about faith and perseverance. The atmosphere was relaxed and cheerful, with passengers looking forward to reaching New York in just 2 more days. Third-class passengers were equally content. The Sage family had established a routine of gathering in the general room after meals to share stories and plan for their new life in Florida. Eugene Daly entertained fellow passengers with his bagpipes, playing traditional Irish airs that reminded the emigrants of home while filling them with hope for the future. The crew was also in good spirits. The ship was performing beautifully, the passengers were happy, and the voyage was proceeding without any significant problems. The officers took pride in their vessel and their professional competence. The stewards enjoyed serving on such a prestigious ship, and even the stokers and engineers in the depths of the ship felt a sense of pride in keeping the mighty engines running smoothly. Thomas Andrews continued his detailed observations, filling notebook after notebook with suggestions for improvements. He had identified several minor issues: a coat hook that was positioned awkwardly, a door that didn't close quite properly, a ventilation grate that was slightly too small. But overall, he was delighted with how his creation was performing. Titanic was exceeding his expectations in almost every way. The ship's band continued to provide musical entertainment throughout the day. They played during meals, in the lounges, and on deck when weather permitted. Their repertoire was extensive, ranging from classical pieces to popular songs of the day. Wallace Hartley was particularly proud of his musicians, and often said that music was the universal language that could bring people together, regardless of their background or social class. As the day progressed, more ice warnings were received by the wireless operators. The steamship Coronia reported bergs, growlers, and field ice in the area ahead of Titanic. The Baltic reported large icebergs 5 miles south of the steamer track. The Californian reported being surrounded by ice and having to stop for the night. These warnings were duly noted and passed along to the bridge, but they didn't cause any significant change in plans. Ice warnings were common during April crossings, and the conditions seemed ideal for spotting and avoiding any obstacles. The sea was calm, the night was clear, and visibility was excellent. Captain Smith and his officers were confident in their ability to navigate safely through any ice field they might encounter. The evening of April 14th was particularly beautiful. The sun set in a blaze of orange and red, painting the sky in brilliant colors that reflected off the calm water. Passengers gathered on deck to watch the spectacular display, many commenting that they had never seen such a beautiful sunset at sea. The air was crisp and clear, with just enough breeze to make the evening pleasant without being uncomfortable. Dinner that evening was especially elaborate in first class. The menu included 11 courses, featuring delicacies like oysters, consomme, poached salmon, filet mignon, roast duckling, and elaborate desserts. The wine list was extensive, featuring the finest French champagnes and vintage wines. The dining room was filled with the sound of conversation, laughter, and the gentle clink of crystal glasses. The Astors dined at the captain's table, along with other prominent passengers. The conversation ranged from business and politics to travel and social gossip. Captain Smith was in excellent spirits, regaling his guests with stories from his long career and expressing his satisfaction with Titanic's performance. He mentioned that this would be his final voyage before retirement, and several passengers toasted his distinguished career. In the La Carte restaurant, Benjamin Guggenheim was hosting a small dinner party for friends he had made during the voyage. The conversation was lively and sophisticated, touching on art, literature, and the latest developments in technology. Guggenheim was known for his wit and charm, and his guests were thoroughly entertained by his stories and observations. The second-class dining room was equally festive, though less formal than first class. Families shared tables, and conversation flowed easily between strangers who had become friends during the voyage. Father Biles said grace before the meal, and his blessings seemed to encompass not just the food, but the entire journey and the hopes and dreams of all aboard. Third-class passengers enjoyed their own version of a festive evening meal. The food was simple but hearty, and the atmosphere was warm and friendly. Children played between the tables, while adults shared stories of their homelands and their plans for America. The general room was filled with the sound of multiple languages as passengers from different countries tried to communicate with gestures and smiles when words failed. After dinner, the evening's entertainment began in earnest. In first class, passengers gathered in the lounge for coffee, liqueurs, and conversation. Some played cards, others read or wrote letters, and many simply enjoyed the company of their fellow travelers. The atmosphere was relaxed and sophisticated, with the gentle hum of refined conversation filling the elegant room. The ship's band played in the first-class lounge, their music providing a perfect backdrop for the evening's socializing. They performed a mix of classical pieces and popular songs, taking requests from passengers and adapting their repertoire to the mood of the room. Wallace Hartley was particularly pleased with how well his musicians were working together, and how much the passengers seemed to enjoy their performances. In second class, passengers gathered in their own lounge for a more informal evening of entertainment. Someone had brought a deck of cards, and several games were in progress. Others gathered around the piano for a sing-along, with passengers taking turns leading songs from their home countries. The atmosphere was warm and friendly, with the barriers between strangers quickly dissolving in the face of shared adventure. Third-class passengers created their own entertainment in the general room and on the well deck. Eugene Daly brought out his bagpipes and played traditional Irish music, while passengers from other countries shared their own folk songs and dances. The children were allowed to stay up later than usual, and they ran around the deck playing games and burning off energy before bedtime. As the evening progressed, the temperature began to drop noticeably. Passengers who had been enjoying the mild weather found themselves reaching for coats and shawls. The sea remained calm, but there was a distinct chill in the air that hadn't been present earlier in the voyage. Some passengers commented on the sudden change, joking that they must be approaching the North Pole. The drop in temperature was actually a significant warning sign that experienced mariners would have recognized. When a ship encounters a large ice field, the temperature of the air and water drops dramatically due to the cooling effect of the ice. The sudden chill that passengers noticed was nature's way of announcing that Titanic was approaching dangerous waters. On the bridge, the officers were well aware of the temperature drop and its implications. Extra lookouts were posted, and the officers maintained a careful watch for any signs of ice. The standard procedure was to maintain course and speed while remaining vigilant, trusting in the excellent visibility and the skill of the lookouts to spot any obstacles in time to avoid them. Captain Smith made his final rounds of the ship, checking with his officers and ensuring that everything was in order for the night. He was satisfied with the ship's performance and the progress they were making. Titanic was on schedule to arrive in New York on Wednesday morning, and Smith was looking forward to completing his final voyage successfully. At 9:40 p.m., the Messaba sent a wireless message reporting heavy pack ice and large icebergs directly in Titanic's path. This message was received by Jack Phillips in the wireless room, but he was busy with passenger messages and didn't immediately deliver it to the bridge. The message was set aside to be delivered later, a delay that would prove tragically significant. At 10:30 p.m., the nearby ship Californian sent a message warning that they were stopped and surrounded by ice. Phillips, still busy with passenger traffic, cut off the Californian's operator with a sharp, "Shut up! Shut up! I'm busy." The Californian's operator, offended by the rude response, turned off his wireless set and went to bed. This breakdown in communication would have devastating consequences in the hours to come. As 11 p.m. approached, most passengers were preparing for bed. The first-class passengers retired to their luxurious staterooms, many commenting on what a perfect day it had been. The Astors said goodnight to their fellow diners and headed to their suite, looking forward to another day of pleasant sailing. Benjamin Guggenheim lingered in the smoking room for a final cigar and brandy, enjoying the company of other gentlemen who weren't quite ready to end the evening. In second class, families were tucking their children into bed and settling in for the night. Lawrence Beasley was in his cabin, writing in his journal about the day's observations and the remarkable engineering of the ship. Father Biles was preparing for his evening prayers, reflecting on the day's conversations and the hopes and dreams he had heard from his fellow passengers. Third-class passengers were also settling in for the night, though the process was more communal in their shared accommodations. The Sage family was getting their 9 children ready for bed, a process that required considerable coordination and patience. Eugene Daly was carefully storing his bagpipes and preparing for sleep, tired but happy after another day of entertaining his fellow passengers. The crew was changing shifts, with the night watch taking over from their daytime colleagues. The officers on the bridge maintained their vigilant watch, scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. The lookouts in the Crow's Nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, began their watch at 10 p.m., their eyes straining to penetrate the darkness ahead. The conditions for spotting ice were actually quite challenging, despite the clear night. There was no moon, which meant the sea was very dark. While the stars were brilliant in the clear sky, they provided little illumination for spotting obstacles on the water. The sea was so calm that there were no waves breaking against icebergs, which would normally create a telltale white foam that could be seen from a distance. Thomas Andrews was still making his rounds, notebook in hand, observing how the ship performed during the night hours. He was particularly interested in how the heating and ventilation systems worked when the outside temperature dropped, and he made several notes on adjustments that could be made to improve passenger comfort. The ship's band had finished their evening performance and was preparing for bed. Wallace Hartley was pleased with how the voyage was going and was already planning the music for the next day. He had received several requests from passengers and was looking forward to surprising them with some special arrangements. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips was still busy with passenger messages. The backlog of personal telegrams was enormous, and he was working overtime to clear them. Harold Bride was sleeping, preparing to take over the night shift. The wireless room was one of the few places on the ship where work continued around the clock, connecting Titanic to the rest of the world through the invisible threads of radio waves. At 11:30 p.m., the lookouts in the Crow's Nest noticed that the temperature had dropped even further. The air was now bitterly cold, and they could see their breath in the starlight. They stamped their feet and rubbed their hands together to keep warm, all while maintaining their careful watch of the sea ahead. The officers on the bridge were also aware of the extreme cold. First Officer Murdoch, who had taken over the watch from Chief Officer Wilde, was experienced enough to know that such a dramatic temperature drop usually meant ice was nearby. He ordered the lookouts to keep an especially sharp watch and made sure the Ship's engines were ready to respond quickly to any orders. At 11:35 p.m., the lookout spotted something ahead. At first, it was just a slight darkening of the horizon, a shadow against the star-filled sky. But as they watched, the shadow grew larger and more distinct. Frederick Fleet grabbed the telephone that connected the crow's nest to the bridge and rang the warning bell 3 times, the signal for an obstacle directly ahead. Iceberg right ahead. Fleet shouted into the telephone. On the bridge, 6th Officer Moody received the call and immediately relayed the warning to 1st Officer Murdoch. Murdoch's response was swift and professional. He ordered hard a starboard. To the helmsman, commanding the ship to turn as sharply as possible to port, left. Simultaneously, he rang the engine room telegraph to full aster, ordering the engines to reverse at maximum power. Murdoch also threw the switch to close the watertight doors, sealing off the compartments in the lower part of the ship. These actions represented the standard emergency procedure for avoiding a collision, and Murdoch executed them with the skill and precision of an experienced officer. But it was too late. Titanic was simply too large and moving too fast to avoid the iceberg completely. The ship began to turn, and for a moment it seemed like she might clear the obstacle. The iceberg passed along the starboard, right side of the ship, scraping against the hull below the waterline. To most passengers, the collision felt like nothing more than a slight tremor. Many didn't even wake up. Those who were still awake described it as feeling like the ship had run over a sandbar or scraped against a dock. There was no dramatic crash, no violent impact, just a gentle grinding sensation that lasted for about 37 seconds. In first class, John Jacob Astor was still awake in his suite when he felt the ship shudder slightly. He looked out his porthole but saw nothing unusual. Benjamin Guggenheim, still in the smoking room, felt the ship slow down and wondered if they had stopped to avoid some obstacle. The sensation was so mild that most passengers assumed it was nothing serious. In second class, Lawrence Beasley was reading in his cabin when he felt what he described as an extra heave of the engines and a pie, more than usually obvious dancing motion on the mattress. He got up to investigate, but saw nothing alarming. Father Biles was saying his evening prayers when he felt the slight tremor, but he continued his devotions without concern. Third-class passengers, being closer to the engines and the point of impact, felt the collision more distinctly. Some woke up and wondered what had happened, but the sensation was so brief and mild that most went back to sleep. The sage children who were still awake asked their parents what the noise was, but any sage assured them it was nothing to worry about. On deck, however, the situation was immediately apparent to anyone who looked. Chunks of ice from the iceberg had fallen onto the forward well deck, and some passengers who came out to investigate began playing with the ice, throwing snowballs, and marveling at the novelty of finding ice in the middle of the ocean. "Look at this," one passenger called out, holding up a piece of ice. Free ice for everyone's drinks. The playful mood wouldn't last long. Thomas Andrews was in his cabin when he felt the collision. His trained engineer's instincts immediately told him that something was seriously wrong. The way the ship shuddered and then seemed to settle slightly told him that the hull had been damaged. He quickly dressed and headed for the bridge to assess the situation. Captain Smith, who had retired to his cabin just minutes before the collision, was awakened by the impact and the sudden stopping of the engines. He immediately came to the bridge, where First Officer Murdoch reported what had happened. "I put her hard a starboard and ran the engines full astern, but it was too close," Murdoch explained. "I tried to port around it, but she hit. I closed the watertight doors." Captain Smith's first action was to order the engines stopped completely. Then he sent for Thomas Andrews to conduct a damage assessment. The two men, along with several officers, began a systematic inspection of the ship to determine the extent of the damage. What they found was devastating. The iceberg had created a series of small punctures along the starboard side of the ship, extending from the forepeak to just past the fourth watertight compartment. The individual holes were not large. Most were no bigger than a person could put their fist through, but their cumulative effect was catastrophic. Water was pouring into the first 5 compartments of the ship. The mailroom was already flooding, with postal workers desperately trying to save the mail bags. The squash court on G-deck was filling with water. In the forward cargo holds, seawater was rising steadily, contaminating luggage and cargo. Thomas Andrews quickly calculated the ship's fate. Titanic had been designed to survive flooding in up to 4 compartments, but not 5. With 5 compartments breached, the ship would inevitably sink. The mathematics were inexorable. As the forward compartments filled with water, the ship's bow would sink lower, allowing water to spill over the tops of the bulkheads into the next compartments. It would be a progressive flooding that nothing could stop. "How long do we have?" Captain Smith asked quietly. Andrews looked at his calculations and then at his pocket watch. It was now 12:15 a.m. on April 15th. "An hour," he said. "An hour and a half at most." The enormity of the situation hit both men immediately. They had approximately 2,200 people aboard, and lifeboats for only 1,178. Even if everything went perfectly, which it never did in an emergency, more than 1,000 people would die. Captain Smith's first priority was to alert other ships in the area. He ordered the wireless operators to begin sending distress calls immediately. Jack Phillips, who had been preparing to end his shift, suddenly found himself sending the most important messages of his career. The first distress call went out at 12:15 a.m. CQD was the international distress signal, and MGY was Titanic's call sign. Phillips repeated the message over and over, hoping that some ship within range would hear and respond. Harold Bride, who had been sleeping, was awakened and told about the emergency. He suggested using the new SOS distress signal, which was just beginning to replace CQD. Phillips began alternating between the 2 signals, making Titanic one of the first ships to use SOS in a real emergency. The response was immediate, but not encouraging. Several ships acknowledged the distress call, but most were too far away to provide immediate assistance. The closest ship that responded was the Carpathia, about 58 miles southeast of Titanic's position. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia immediately ordered his ship to steam at maximum speed toward Titanic, but even at full speed, it would take nearly 4 hours to reach the sinking ship. Other ships also responded to the distress calls. The Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, was about 500 miles away and began steaming toward the position, but she was too far away to arrive in time. The Frankfurt, a German ship, was closer but still several hours away. The Baltic and other ships also changed course to assist, but none could reach Titanic before she was expected to sink. Unknown to those aboard Titanic, the ship Californian was only about 10 miles away. The Californian had stopped for the night due to ice and had turned off her wireless set after the rude exchange with Phillips earlier in the evening. The crew of the Californian could actually see Titanic's lights in the distance, but they assumed it was just another ship passing through the area. As the distress calls went out, Captain Smith faced the terrible task of ordering the evacuation of the ship. At 12:25 a.m., he gave the order to uncover the lifeboats and muster the passengers and crew at their boat stations. The order was given quietly and calmly, without any general alarm that might cause panic. The crew began the process of waking passengers and directing them to the boat deck. Stewards went from cabin to cabin, knocking on doors and telling passengers to put on their life jackets and come to the boat deck. The instructions were given calmly and politely, with many stewards telling passengers that it was just a precautionary measure. The response from passengers was mixed. Many, particularly in first class, were reluctant to leave their warm, comfortable cabins for the cold deck. The ship didn't seem to be in any immediate danger. She was sitting level in the water. The lights were on. and there was no sense of urgency from the crew. "Do we really need to go up on deck?" asked one first-class passenger. "It's frightfully cold out there, and the ship seems perfectly fine." "Just a precaution, sir," replied the steward. "Captain's orders. Please bring your life jacket." In second class, passengers were more compliant, but equally confused. Lawrence Beasley was awakened by a steward and told to put on his life jacket and go to the boat deck. He noticed that the ship seemed to be listing slightly to starboard, and that the engines had stopped completely, but he still didn't grasp the severity of the situation. Third-class passengers faced additional challenges. Many of the stewards assigned to third class were needed elsewhere, so the evacuation process was slower and less organized. Language barriers also complicated matters, as many third-class passengers spoke little or no English and didn't understand the instructions they were being given. The Sage family was awakened by the commotion in the corridors and the sound of people moving about. John Sage, the father, went to investigate and was told by a steward to get his family ready to go to the boat deck. The process of getting 9 children dressed and organized was time-consuming, and by the time they were ready, the situation had become much more serious. Eugene Daly was awakened by a fellow passenger who told him something was wrong with the ship. Daly grabbed his bagpipes, they were his most precious possession, and headed for the deck. He found chaos and confusion, with passengers milling about in their nightclothes, unsure of what was happening. The process of loading the lifeboats began at 12:45 a.m., nearly an hour after the collision. The delay was partly due to the time needed to wake and muster the passengers, but it was also due to the crew's inexperience with the new David system used to lower the boats. Many crew members had never participated in a full lifeboat drill and were unsure of the proper procedures. The first boat to be lowered was Lifeboat 7 on the starboard side. It had a capacity of 65 people, but was lowered with only 28 aboard. The boat was under the command of Lookout Hogg, who had been pressed into service as a boat commander despite having no experience with lifeboats. The reluctance of passengers to get into the boats was a major problem. From the deck of Titanic, the lifeboats looked tiny and fragile compared to the massive, seemingly stable ship. The idea of being lowered 70 feet to the dark, cold ocean in a small wooden boat was terrifying to many passengers. "I'm not getting in that thing," declared one first-class lady. "It looks like a bathtub with oars. I'll wait for a proper rescue ship." The women and children first protocol was implemented, but it was interpreted differently on different parts of the ship. On the port side, Second Officer Lytler interpreted it strictly, allowing no men into the boats unless they were needed to row. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch was more flexible, allowing men to board if there were no women or children waiting. This difference in interpretation led to some boats being launched half-empty, while others were filled to capacity. The lack of proper boat drills and the crew's unfamiliarity with the evacuation procedures contributed to the confusion and inefficiency. Benjamin Guggenheim appeared on deck impeccably dressed in evening wear, having changed from his nightclothes into his finest suit. When offered a place in a lifeboat, he declined, saying, "We are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He and his valet, Victor Giglio, were seen helping women and children into the boats, maintaining their dignity and composure, even as the situation became increasingly desperate. John Jacob Astor helped his pregnant wife Madeline into Lifeboat 4, then asked if he could accompany her given her condition. Second Officer Lytler refused, saying that no men would be allowed in the boats while women and children were still aboard. Astor accepted the decision gracefully and stepped back, telling his wife he would follow on another boat. It was the last time they would see each other. Isidore and Ida Strauss faced a heartbreaking decision when offered places in a lifeboat. Ida was helped toward the boat, but when she realized her husband couldn't come with her, she stepped back. "Where you go, I go," she told him. "We have lived together for 40 years. Where you go, I go. The elderly couple was last seen sitting together on deck chairs, holding hands as the ship settled lower in the water. Thomas Andrews continued his inspection of the ship, checking on the flooding and trying to estimate how much time remained. He was seen throughout the ship, helping passengers find life jackets and directing them toward the boat deck. His calm professionalism in the face of disaster was remarkable. He showed no panic, no despair, just a quiet determination to help as many people as possible survive the sinking of his creation. The ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, assembled on the boat deck and began playing music to help keep passengers calm. They started with ragtime and popular songs, trying to maintain a cheerful atmosphere. As the situation became more serious, they switched to hymns and more solemn music. Their performance in the face of certain death would become one of the most legendary aspects of the Titanic disaster. "Gentlemen," Hartley reportedly said to his musicians, "it has been a privilege playing with you tonight." They continued playing until the very end, their music providing comfort and courage to passengers and crew alike. As more lifeboats were launched, the ship's list to starboard became more pronounced. The bow was noticeably lower in the water, and passengers could see that the ship was indeed sinking. The realization that this was not just a precautionary measure, but a fight for survival, began to dawn on everyone aboard. The loading of the lifeboats became more urgent as the ship's condition deteriorated. Lifeboat 6 was launched with only 28 people, including Margaret Molly Brown, who would later become famous for her efforts to organize the survivors and convince the boat's crew to return to look for survivors in the water. Brown's forceful personality and natural leadership abilities made her a rallying point for the other passengers in her boat. "We need to go back for those people in the water," Brown insisted, but Quartermaster Higgins, who was in charge of the boat, refused, claiming it would be suicide to return to the sinking ship. The argument would continue throughout the night, with Brown eventually taking partial control of the boat and helping to keep the other passengers' spirits up. Father Biles appeared on deck and began hearing confessions and giving absolution to passengers who requested it. The Catholic priest moved calmly among the crowd, offering spiritual comfort to people of all faiths. His presence was enormously comforting to many passengers, and he continued his ministry until the very end, choosing to stay aboard rather than take a place in a lifeboat. The wireless operators continued their desperate calls for help. Phillips remained at his post, sending distress signals, even as the power began to fail and water crept closer to the wireless room. Harold Bride assisted him, and together they maintained contact with the outside world until the very last moments. The Carpathia responded to their calls, confirming that she was racing toward Titanic at maximum speed. Captain Rostron had ordered every available stoker to the boilers, pushing his ship beyond her normal limits. The Carpathia's crew was preparing for a massive rescue operation, setting up medical stations, preparing blankets and hot food, and organizing accommodations for survivors. But the Carpathia was still hours away, and Titanic was running out of time. As the ship settled deeper into the water, the angle of the deck became more pronounced. Walking became difficult, and loose objects began sliding toward the bow. The ship's lights flickered occasionally as the electrical system struggled with the flooding, but the engineers below decks kept the power running as long as possible. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his men remained at their posts in the engine room, keeping the power on and the pumps running even as water rose around them. Their sacrifice ensured that the lights stayed on and the wireless continued to function, giving passengers and crew the best possible chance of survival. None of the engineering staff survived, but their heroism saved countless lives. The contrast between the different classes became more apparent as the evacuation continued. First-class passengers had easier access to the boat deck and were generally given priority in the loading process. Second-class passengers faced more challenges, but were still relatively well served. Third-class passengers, however, found themselves at a severe disadvantage. Many third-class passengers were trapped below decks by locked gates and unfamiliar corridors. The ship's design, which segregated the classes during normal operations, became a death trap during the emergency. Some stewards tried to help, but others abandoned their posts or were overwhelmed by the chaos. The Sage family struggled to reach the boat deck with their 9 children. The corridors were crowded and confusing, and the family became separated in the chaos. By the time they reached the upper decks, most of the lifeboats had already been launched. The entire family would perish in the disaster, one of the most tragic losses of the night. Eugene Daly managed to reach the boat deck with his bagpipes, but he found the situation increasingly desperate. He helped load women and children into the boats and played his pipes to help keep people calm. At one point, he jumped into the water and swam to a lifeboat, becoming one of the few third-class male passengers to survive. As the bow sank lower, the stern began to rise out of the water. The ship's massive propellers became visible, and passengers could see the enormous rudder that had been hidden beneath the waves. The sight was both awesome and terrifying, a reminder of the ship's incredible size and the enormous magnitude of the disaster unfolding. Lifeboat 1, one of the smaller emergency boats, was launched with only 12 people aboard, despite having a capacity of 40. Boat was under the command of Lookout Simmons and included Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife, Lady Lucille Duff Gordon, along with her secretary. The decision to launch such a lightly loaded boat would later cause considerable controversy and accusations of cowardice. The last regular lifeboat, Boat 4, was finally launched at 1:55 a.m. with 40 people aboard, including Madeline Astor and several other first-class women. The boat had been delayed because the crew had difficulty opening the windows on A deck to allow passengers to board. By the time it was launched, the ship's list was so severe that the boat nearly capsized as it hit the water. With all the regular lifeboats gone, attention turned to the 4 Engelhart collapsible boats. These canvas-sided boats were stored on top of the officers' quarters and required considerable effort to launch. 2 of them, Boats C and B, were successfully launched, but the other 2 would prove more problematic. Boat C was launched with 39 people, including J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line. Ismay's decision to save himself, while so many others perished, would haunt him for the rest of his life and make him one of the most controversial figures in the disaster. Critics would accuse him of cowardice, while defenders argued that he only took a place when no women or children were waiting. Boat D, the last boat to be successfully launched, carried 20 people, including several children. The boat was lowered just as the ship's bridge was going underwater, making it a narrow escape for those aboard. The 2 remaining collapsible boats, A and B, were swept off the ship as she sank. Boat A landed right side up, but was partially flooded and provided precarious refuge for about 20 people. Boat B landed upside down and became a makeshift raft for about 30 men, including Second Officer Leitler and wireless operator Harold Bride. As the last boats were being launched, the ship's condition became critical. The bow was completely submerged, and water was pouring into the ship through open portholes and doors. The angle of the deck made it nearly impossible to walk, and passengers and crew members were sliding toward the bow. Captain Smith was last seen on the bridge, having released his crew from their duties with the words, "It's every man for himself now." Some witnesses reported seeing him swimming in the water near the ship, while others claimed he went down with his ship. His exact fate remains one of the mysteries of the disaster. Thomas Andrews was last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting and apparently lost in thought. A steward reported seeing him there, his life jacket removed and placed on a nearby table. Andrews seemed to have accepted his fate with quiet dignity, perhaps reflecting on the ship he had designed with such care and pride. The ship's band continued playing until the very end. Witnesses reported hearing them play the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee," as the ship made her final plunge, though some survivors insisted they were playing a different tune. Regardless of what they played, Their courage and dedication provided comfort to hundreds of people in their final moments. At approximately 2:05 a.m., the ship's lights went out for the final time as the electrical system finally failed. The sudden darkness was terrifying for those still aboard and those watching from the lifeboats. The only illumination came from the stars above and the occasional flash of distress rockets that had been fired throughout the night. The final moments of Titanic were both spectacular and horrifying. As the bow sank deeper, the stern rose higher out of the water, creating an increasingly steep angle. The stress on the ship's hull became enormous, and witnesses reported hearing loud cracking and groaning sounds as the steel structure began to fail. At approximately 2:17 a.m., the ship broke apart between the third and fourth funnels. The bow section, which was completely flooded, sank immediately and disappeared into the depths. The stern section, which still contained air pockets, fell back into the water with a tremendous splash, then floated for a few more minutes before beginning its own final plunge. The breakup of the ship was witnessed by hundreds of people in the lifeboats, and their descriptions of the event were both vivid and traumatic. The sound of the ship breaking apart was described as like thunder or like a massive building collapsing. The sight of the enormous stern section rising out of the water and then disappearing forever was something that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. At 2:20 a.m., the stern section of RMS Titanic disappeared beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, taking with her more than 1,500 people. The ship that had been called practically unsinkable had sunk in less than 3 hours, becoming one of the greatest maritime disasters in history. But the tragedy was far from over. In the water around the sinking ship, more than 1,500 people were struggling for their lives in the 28-degree water. The cold was so intense that most people could survive only 15 to 30 minutes before succumbing to hypothermia. The sounds of people calling for help, crying out in pain and fear, and gradually falling silent created a symphony of human suffering that would haunt the survivors forever. The lifeboats, now scattered across several miles of ocean, faced their own challenges. Most were overcrowded, understaffed, and poorly equipped for a long wait in the middle of the Atlantic. The occupants were cold, frightened, and traumatized by what they had witnessed. In Lifeboat 6, Molly Brown continued her efforts to convince Quartermaster Hickens to return to look for survivors. "There are people dying in that water," she insisted. "We have to go back." But Hickens refused, claiming that the suction from the sinking ship would pull them down, and that desperate survivors would swamp their boat. The argument about returning to look for survivors occurred in several boats, but only one boat, number 14, under the command of 5th Officer Lowe, actually went back. Lowe waited until the cries from the water had mostly stopped, then rowed back to the debris field. He managed to pull only one living person from the water, a Chinese passenger who had been clinging to a piece of wreckage. The failure to return for survivors remains one of the most controversial aspects of the disaster. The lifeboats had a combined capacity of about 1,178 people, but were carrying only about 710 survivors. There was room for several hundred more people, but fear and poor leadership prevented most boats from attempting rescues. Second Officer Lytler, who was clinging to the overturned collapsible B with about 30 other men, showed remarkable leadership in organizing the survivors on the makeshift raft. He had the men shift their weight in unison to keep the boat balanced as waves threatened to wash them off. His calm authority and seamanship probably saved the lives of everyone on the boat. Harold Bride, the wireless operator, was also on Collapsible B, suffering from frostbitten feet but alive. He would later provide one of the most detailed accounts of the ship's final moments and the heroism of his colleague Jack Phillips, who had remained at the wireless set until the very end and did not survive. As dawn approached, the survivors faced new challenges. The lifeboats were scattered over a wide area, making it difficult for rescue ships to locate them all. The occupants were cold, thirsty, and exhausted. Some boats had adequate supplies of water and food, while others had almost nothing. The social dynamics in the boats were fascinating and sometimes troubling. In some boats, class distinctions disappeared as people worked together for survival. In others, the rigid social hierarchy of 1912 persisted even in the face of disaster. Some first-class passengers expected to be served by crew members, while some crew members continued to defer to their social superiors, even in the lifeboats. At approximately 3:30 a.m., the survivors in the lifeboats saw a light on the horizon. It was the Carpathia, racing toward them at maximum speed. Captain Rostron had pushed his ship beyond her normal limits, and his crew had worked tirelessly to prepare for the rescue operation. The sight of the rescue ship's lights brought tears of relief and joy to the survivors. After hours of uncertainty and fear, help was finally at hand. The Carpathia began firing rockets to signal her approach, and the survivors responded with cheers and their own signals. The rescue operation began at dawn and continued throughout the morning. The Carpathia's crew worked with remarkable efficiency, hauling survivors aboard and providing immediate medical attention, warm clothing, and hot food. The ship's passengers, who had been awakened and told about the disaster, donated clothing and personal items to help the survivors. Molly Brown immediately took charge of organizing relief efforts for the survivors, using her forceful personality and organizational skills to coordinate the distribution of supplies and comfort the traumatized passengers. Her efforts during and after the disaster would earn her the nickname, the unsinkable Molly Brown, and make her a legendary figure in American folklore. The survivors' stories began to emerge as they were brought aboard the Carpathia. The tales of heroism and cowardice, of love and loss, of split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, painted a complex picture of human nature under extreme stress. Lawrence Beasley, the second-class passenger and teacher, began taking detailed notes about the disaster, recognizing that he was witnessing history. His account would later become one of the most reliable and comprehensive survivor testimonies, providing valuable insights into both the technical aspects of the sinking and the human drama that unfolded. The wireless operators aboard the Carpathia began sending news of the disaster to the outside world. The first reports were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, leading to confusion and false hope. Some early reports suggested that all passengers had been saved, while others indicated that the ship was still afloat and being towed to port. As the true scope of the disaster became clear, the world reacted with shock and disbelief. The unsinkable ship had sunk on her maiden voyage, taking with her some of the most prominent people of the era. The disaster challenged assumptions about technology, progress, and human mastery over nature. The passenger manifest read like a casualty list of the social elite. John Jacob Astor, IV, one of the richest men in America, had perished, leaving behind his pregnant young wife. Benjamin Guggenheim had died as he had lived, with style and dignity. Isidor and Ida Strauss had chosen to die together rather than be separated. The loss of such prominent figures made the disaster front-page news around the world. But the disaster was not just about the famous victims. The majority of those who died were ordinary people, immigrants seeking a better life in America, working-class families, crew members doing their jobs. Their stories were equally tragic and equally important, though they received less attention in the press. The statistics of survival revealed the harsh realities of class and gender in 1912. Of the first-class passengers, 62% survived. Of the second-class passengers, 41% survived. Of the third-class passengers, only 24% survived. The disparity was due to a combination of factors: better access to the boat deck, priority in loading, and the simple fact that first-class passengers were more likely to understand English and follow evacuation instructions. The women and children first protocol was generally followed, but with significant variations. Overall, 74% of women survived compared to only 20% of men. However, the survival rates varied significantly by class. First-class women had a 97% survival rate, while third-class women had only a 49% survival rate. Children's survival rates also varied by class. All first-class children survived, as did all second-class children. However, 34% of third-class children perished, including all 9 of the Sage children and both of the Anderson children under age 15. The crew's survival rate was particularly low at just 24%. This was partly due to their dedication to duty. Many crew members stayed at their posts to help passengers evacuate, and partly due to the fact that they were not given priority in the lifeboats. As the Carpathia steamed toward New York with the survivors, the world struggled to understand how such a disaster could have occurred. The ship had been designed by the best engineers, built by the most skilled craftsmen, and operated by experienced professionals. How could it all have gone so wrong? The immediate cause of the disaster was clear. The ship had struck an iceberg and sunk. But the underlying causes were more complex and would be debated for decades to come. Was it excessive speed in dangerous conditions? Inadequate lifeboat capacity? Poor evacuation procedures? Design flaws? Human error? The answer, as investigations would reveal, was all of the above. The wireless communications during the disaster revealed both the potential and the limitations of the new technology. The distress calls had been heard by ships hundreds of miles away, and rescue efforts had been coordinated across the Atlantic. But the breakdown in communication with the nearby Californian had potentially cost hundreds of lives. The Californian controversy would become one of the most debated aspects of the disaster. The ship was close enough to see Titanic's lights and distress rockets, but her crew failed to respond effectively. Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian would spend the rest of his life defending his actions that night, but many believed that a prompt response from his ship could have saved most or all of Titanic's passengers and crew. The role of ice warnings in the disaster was also controversial. Multiple ships had sent warnings about ice in the area, but these warnings had not resulted in any significant change to Titanic's course or speed. The practice of maintaining schedule despite ice warnings was common in 1912, but the Titanic disaster would force a complete reevaluation of maritime safety practices. The role of ice warnings in the disaster was also controversial. Multiple ships had sent warnings about ice in the area, but these warnings had not resulted in any significant change to Titanic's course or speed. The practice of maintaining schedule despite ice warnings was common in 1912, but the Titanic disaster would force a complete reevaluation of maritime safety practices. Captain Smith's decision to maintain speed through the ice field was consistent with standard practice of the time. Ships routinely maintained course and speed while posting extra lookouts, trusting in good visibility and experienced seamanship to avoid obstacles. The calm, clear conditions on the night of April 14th seemed ideal for this approach, but they actually made ice detection more difficult by eliminating the telltale white foam that waves normally create when they break against icebergs. The design of the ship itself came under scrutiny. While Titanic could survive flooding in 4 compartments, the collision had breached 5. The watertight bulkheads, which were supposed to contain flooding, only extended a few feet above the waterline. As the ship settled by the bow, water spilled over the tops of the bulkheads into adjacent compartments, creating the progressive flooding that doomed the ship. Some naval architects argued that if the ship had hit the iceberg head-on instead of trying to avoid it, the damage might have been contained to the first 1 or 2 compartments, and the ship might have survived. This counterintuitive theory suggested that First Officer Murdoch's quick-thinking and seaman-like response had actually made the disaster worse. However, a head-on collision at 22 knots would likely have killed everyone in the forward part of the ship, so Murdoch's actions, while ultimately unsuccessful, were still the correct response given the information available to him. The lifeboat capacity was perhaps the most obvious flaw in the ship's safety systems. Titanic carried boats for only about 1/3 of the people aboard, and this was actually in compliance with British Board of Trade regulations. The regulations were based on the ship's tonnage rather than the number of people aboard, and they had not been updated to account for the massive increase in ship size that had occurred in recent years. The regulations assumed that ships would sink slowly, allowing time for multiple trips by the lifeboats, or that other ships would arrive quickly to assist in the evacuation. The Titanic disaster proved both assumptions wrong. The ship sank too quickly for multiple trips, and the nearest responding ship was hours away. Even the lifeboats that were available were not used to their full capacity. The boats had a combined capacity of 1,178 people, but carried only about 710 survivors. This was due to a combination of factors: passenger reluctance to leave the seemingly safe ship for small boats, crew inexperience with the evacuation procedures, and the general confusion and panic that accompanied the disaster. The crew's lack of training in emergency procedures was a significant factor in the high casualty rate. While individual crew members showed remarkable heroism and dedication, the overall evacuation was poorly organized and inefficient. There had been no comprehensive boat drill during the voyage, and many crew members were unfamiliar with their emergency assignments. The class-based segregation of the ship, which was a source of pride during normal operations, became a death trap during the emergency. Third-class passengers found themselves trapped below decks by locked gates and unfamiliar corridors. While some of these barriers were opened during the evacuation, others remained locked, and many third-class passengers never reached the boat deck. The language barriers faced by many third-class passengers also contributed to the high casualty rate in that class. Many immigrants spoke little or no English and couldn't understand the evacuation instructions. Some stewards tried to help, but the crew was overwhelmed, and many abandoned their posts as the situation became desperate. As the Carpathia approached New York with the survivors, the world's press prepared for one of the biggest stories of the century. Reporters chartered boats to meet the ship before she docked, hoping to get the first interviews with survivors. The White Star Line's New York office was besieged by relatives of passengers seeking information about their loved ones. The arrival of the Carpathia in New York on the evening of April 18th was a scene of incredible drama and emotion. Thousands of people gathered at the pier, including relatives of passengers, reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers. The ship first stopped at the White Star Line pier to unload Titanic's lifeboats, a grim reminder of the disaster, before proceeding to the Cunard Pier to disembark the survivors. The scenes at the pier were heartbreaking. Families were reunited with loved ones they had feared were dead, while others learned definitively that their relatives had perished. Madeline Astor, now a widow at 18 and pregnant with her late husband's child, was met by the Astor family and whisked away from the crowds. Molly Brown was greeted as a hero, her efforts during and after the disaster having made her famous around the world. The survivors' stories began to emerge in newspaper interviews and official inquiries. The tales of heroism were inspiring. The ship's band playing until the end, the engineers staying at their posts to keep the power on, passengers helping strangers into lifeboats, crew members sacrificing their own lives to save others. But there were also stories of cowardice and selfishness that tarnished the heroic narrative. Some men had disguised themselves as women to get into lifeboats. Others had pushed aside women and children in their desperation to save themselves. The rigid class system had condemned many third-class passengers to death, while first-class passengers were saved. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, who had survived by taking a place in one of the last lifeboats, became a particular target of criticism. The press dubbed him J. Brute Ismay and accused him of cowardice for saving himself while so many others perished. Ismay maintained that he had only taken a place when no women or children were waiting, but the stigma would follow him for the rest of his life. The official inquiries into the disaster began almost immediately. The American inquiry, led by Senator William Alden Smith, began while the Carpathia was still at sea, with investigators boarding the ship as soon as she docked. The British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, was more formal and technical, but equally thorough. The inquiries heard testimony from dozens of survivors, crew members, and maritime experts. The testimony revealed a complex web of factors that had contributed to the disaster. Excessive speed in dangerous conditions, inadequate safety equipment, poor emergency procedures, design flaws, and simple bad luck. Captain Smith was criticized for maintaining speed despite ice warnings, but many maritime experts defended his actions as consistent with standard practice. The ice conditions on April 14th were unusual. The winter had been mild, causing more icebergs than normal to drift south into the shipping lanes. The calm, clear conditions that seemed ideal for navigation actually made ice detection more difficult. The lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, testified about the lack of binoculars in the crow's nest. Fleet maintained that binoculars might have allowed them to spot the iceberg sooner, though maritime experts were divided on whether this would have made a difference given the conditions. First Officer Murdoch was praised for his quick response to the iceberg sighting, but some questioned whether his actions had made the collision worse. The decision to reverse the engines while turning hard to port may have reduced the ship's maneuverability, making it harder to avoid the iceberg. However, most experts agreed that Murdoch had followed standard procedure and that his actions were reasonable given the circumstances. The wireless operators received mixed reviews. Jack Phillips was praised for his dedication in sending distress calls until the very end, but he was also criticized for his rude treatment of the Californian's operator, which may have prevented that ship from responding to the emergency. The prioritization of passenger messages over official communications was also questioned. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was universally praised for his heroism during the disaster. Survivors testified that he had moved throughout the ship, helping passengers find life jackets and directing them to the boat deck. His calm professionalism and self-sacrifice in the face of his creation's destruction made him one of the most admired figures of the disaster. The inquiries resulted in significant changes to maritime safety regulations. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, was established in 1914, requiring ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. The convention also established standards for lifeboat drills, radio watch procedures, and ice patrol services. The United States Coast Guard began operating an international ice patrol to track icebergs and warn ships of dangerous ice conditions. This service, which continues today, has been remarkably successful. No ship following ice patrol warnings has been lost to ice since the service began. Radio watch procedures were also changed to require 24-hour monitoring of distress frequencies. The breakdown in communication with the Californian had highlighted the dangers of ships turning off their wireless sets at night. The disaster also led to changes in ship design. New ships were required to have watertight bulkheads that extended higher above the waterline and improved subdivision to limit flooding. The lessons learned from Titanic's design flaws were incorporated into future vessels, making them significantly safer. The human stories of the disaster continued to emerge in the years following the sinking. Survivors wrote memoirs, gave lectures, and shared their experiences with family and friends. The disaster became a defining moment in their lives, something that shaped their perspectives and priorities forever. Lawrence Beasley wrote one of the first comprehensive accounts of the disaster, The Loss of the SS Titanic, published just months after the sinking. His detailed, analytical approach provided valuable insights into both the technical aspects of the disaster and the human drama that unfolded. Archibald Gracie, a first-class passenger who survived by clinging to an overturned lifeboat, wrote The Truth About the Titanic, which provided another detailed survivor account. Gracie's book was particularly valuable because he had interviewed many other survivors and corroborated their stories. The disaster had a profound impact on popular culture, inspiring countless books, films, songs, and other artistic works. The story of the unsinkable ship that sank on her maiden voyage became a powerful metaphor for human hubris and the dangers of overconfidence in technology. The class distinctions that had been so apparent during the disaster became a symbol of social inequality and injustice. The fact that first-class passengers had a much higher survival rate than third-class passengers highlighted the rigid social hierarchies of the early 20th century and contributed to growing demands for social reform. The heroism displayed by many passengers and crew members became legendary. The ship's band playing until the end, the engineers staying at their posts, passengers helping strangers into lifeboats. These stories provided inspiration and hope in the face of tragedy. The disaster also had significant economic impacts. The White Star Line's reputation was severely damaged, and the company never fully recovered. Insurance claims from the disaster were enormous, and several insurance companies were bankrupted. The shipping industry as a whole was forced to invest heavily in new safety equipment and procedures. The families of the victims faced not only emotional trauma, but also financial hardship. Many of the men who died had been the primary breadwinners for their families, leaving widows and children in difficult circumstances. Relief funds were established to help the families, but the assistance was often inadequate. The crew members who survived faced particular challenges. Many lost their jobs when the ship sank, and some faced criticism for their actions during the disaster. The rigid hierarchy of shipboard life meant that junior crew members had little voice in the official inquiries, and their perspectives were often overlooked. The disaster also highlighted the dangers faced by maritime workers. The crew had a lower survival rate than passengers, partly because they stayed at their posts to help with the evacuation. The heroism of the crew was widely praised, but it also raised questions about the expectations placed on maritime workers and their rights to self-preservation. The international nature of the disaster, with victims from many countries and the ship sinking in international waters, raised complex legal questions about jurisdiction and liability. The resulting legal battles continued for years, with various courts trying to determine responsibility and compensation. The search for the wreck of Titanic became one of the most famous maritime mysteries of the 20th century. Numerous expeditions attempted to locate the ship, but the extreme depth and harsh conditions of the North Atlantic made the search extremely difficult. The wreck was finally discovered in 1985 by Robert Ballard, lying in two main sections on the ocean floor, at a depth of about 12,500 feet. The discovery of the wreck provided new insights into the disaster. The ship had indeed broken apart during the sinking, as some survivors had reported, but others had disputed. The bow and stern sections were found about 2,000 feet apart, surrounded by a debris field containing thousands of artifacts. The condition of the wreck also revealed the ongoing effects of the disaster. The ship was slowly deteriorating due to corrosion and the action of iron-eating bacteria. Many artifacts had been preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor environment, but the ship itself was gradually returning to the elements. The exploration of the wreck raised ethical questions about disturbing what many considered to be a grave site. Thousands of people had died in and around the ship, and their remains were still on the ocean floor. The removal of artifacts from the wreck was controversial, with some arguing that it was important for historical research, and others maintaining that the site should be left undisturbed. The Centennial of the disaster in 2012 brought renewed attention to the story of Titanic. New books, documentaries, and exhibitions explored various aspects of the disaster, from the technical details of the sinking to the personal stories of passengers and crew. The anniversary also prompted reflection on how the disaster had changed maritime safety and what lessons it still held for the modern world. The story of Titanic continues to fascinate people more than a century after the disaster. The ship has become a symbol of human ambition and fallibility, a reminder that even the most advanced technology can fail, and that nature still holds the ultimate power over human endeavors. The disaster also serves as a case study in crisis management, leadership, and human behavior under extreme stress. The varied responses of passengers and crew, from heroic self-sacrifice to cowardly self-preservation, illustrate the full range of human nature when faced with life-and-death situations. The class distinctions that were so apparent during the disaster continue to resonate in discussions of social inequality and justice. The fact that survival was so closely correlated with social class and economic status remains a powerful indictment of the social systems of the early 20th century and a reminder of ongoing inequalities in the modern world. The technological aspects of the disaster also remain relevant as society continues to grapple with the relationship between human beings and technology. The confidence in Titanic's unsinkable design parallels modern faith in various technologies, from nuclear power to artificial intelligence, and serves as a reminder of the importance of humility and caution in the face of complex systems. The communication failures that contributed to the disaster, from the missed ice warnings to the breakdown with the Californian, highlight the critical importance of effective communication in crisis situations. These lessons remain relevant in an age of increasingly complex communication systems and global interconnectedness. The environmental aspects of the disaster have also gained attention in recent years. The location of the sinking, in the middle of one of the world's most important shipping lanes, highlighted the environmental risks of maritime transportation. The ongoing deterioration of the wreck has raised questions about the long-term environmental impact of shipwrecks and the responsibility for cleaning up maritime disasters. The story of Titanic is ultimately a human story, a tale of dreams and ambitions, of love and loss, of heroism and cowardice, of the triumph of human spirit in the face of tragedy. The ship was more than just a vessel. She was a symbol of human achievement and aspiration, a floating city that represented the best of early 20th century technology and luxury. The passengers who boarded Titanic in April 1912 were pursuing their own dreams and ambitions. The wealthy first-class passengers were traveling for business or pleasure, confident in their place in the world and their ability to shape their own destinies. The middle-class second-class passengers were pursuing opportunities and adventures, seeking to improve their circumstances through hard work and determination. The third-class passengers were chasing the ultimate dream, a new life in America, the land of opportunity. The crew members were professionals doing their jobs, proud of their skills and their service aboard the world's most famous ship. They had dedicated their lives to the sea and to serving others, and they maintained that dedication even in the face of death. The disaster shattered these dreams and ambitions in the space of a few hours. Families were torn apart, fortunes were lost, careers were ended, and lives were cut short. But the disaster also revealed the best of human nature, the capacity for self-sacrifice, courage, and compassion in the face of overwhelming tragedy. The legacy of Titanic is complex and multifaceted. The disaster was a tragedy of enormous proportions, but it also led to significant improvements in maritime safety that have saved countless lives in the century since. The stories of heroism and sacrifice continue to inspire people around the world, while the lessons learned from the disaster continue to inform discussions of technology, safety, and social responsibility. The ship herself has become an icon, her image instantly recognizable around the world. The story of her maiden voyage and tragic end has been told and retold in countless ways, each generation finding new meanings and relevance in the tale. Perhaps most importantly, Titanic serves as a reminder of the fragility of human life and the importance of cherishing every moment. The passengers and crew who boarded the ship in April 1912 had no way of knowing that they were embarking on a journey that would end in disaster. They were simply living their lives, pursuing their dreams, and looking forward to the future. The randomness of survival, who lived and who died often came down to a matter of minutes or even seconds, underscores the unpredictable nature of life itself. A passenger who lingered over dinner might miss a lifeboat, while someone who happened to be on deck at the right moment might be saved. These arbitrary factors determined not just individual fates, but the course of entire family lines and the trajectory of history itself. The children who survived the disaster grew up to become living links to one of history's most famous events. They carried with them not just their own memories, but the stories and experiences of those who didn't survive. Milvina Dean, the youngest survivor at just 2 months old when the ship sank, became a celebrity in her later years, attending Titanic conventions and sharing what little she could remember of that fateful night. The psychological impact of the disaster on survivors was profound and long-lasting. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and depression for years after the event. Some survivors refused to travel by ship again, while others became obsessed with maritime safety and spent their lives advocating for better regulations and procedures. The guilt experienced by many survivors was particularly difficult to bear. Why had they lived when so many others had died? This survivor's guilt was compounded by the criticism some faced for their actions during the disaster. Even those who had behaved heroically sometimes questioned whether they could have done more to save others. The disaster also had unexpected positive consequences for some survivors. Molly Brown's heroic actions during and after the sinking made her a celebrity and gave her a platform to advocate for women's rights and social causes. Her story became a symbol of American resilience and determination, inspiring the Broadway musical and Hollywood film The Unsinkable Molly Brown. The crew members who survived faced unique challenges. Many lost not just their jobs, but their entire careers when Titanic sank. The maritime industry was small and close-knit, and the stigma of being associated with such a famous disaster could follow a sailor for the rest of his working life. Some crew members changed their names or moved to different countries to escape the notoriety. The officers who survived, particularly Second Officer Lightler, faced intense scrutiny of their actions during the disaster. Lightler's strict interpretation of women and children first was both praised and criticized, and he spent years defending his decisions. His later career included service in both World Wars, where he continued to demonstrate the courage and leadership he had shown during the Titanic disaster. The disaster had a profound impact on the families of those who perished. Widows were left to raise children alone, often in difficult financial circumstances. The Astor family fortune meant that Madeline Astor was financially secure, but many other widows faced poverty and hardship. The loss of breadwinners was particularly devastating for working-class families, where the death of the father often meant destitution for the entire family. The children who lost parents in the disaster faced their own unique challenges. Some were too young to remember their fathers, growing up with only stories and photographs to connect them to the men who had died. Others had vivid memories of their last moments with their parents, memories that would shape their entire lives. The Navertell boys, Michelle and Edmund, became known as the Titanic orphans after their father died in the sinking. Their mother, who had been searching for them since their father had taken them from France, was reunited with them in New York after seeing their photographs in the newspaper. The boys' story became one of the few bright spots in the tragedy, a tale of family reunion in the midst of so much loss. The disaster also had significant impacts on the communities from which the passengers and crew had come. Southampton, where most of the crew lived, was devastated by the loss of so many breadwinners. Entire streets lost multiple residents, and the city's maritime community was shattered. Memorial services were held around the world, and monuments were erected to commemorate the victims. The Irish community was particularly hard hit, as many of the third-class passengers who boarded at Queenstown were Irish immigrants seeking a better life in America. The loss of so many young people represented not just individual tragedies, but a blow to Ireland's future, as these emigrants had been among the country's most ambitious and hopeful citizens. The disaster also had lasting effects on the shipping industry beyond the immediate safety improvements. Public confidence in ocean travel was shaken, and it took years for passenger numbers to recover. The White Star Line never fully recovered from the disaster, and the company was eventually absorbed by its rival, Cunard Line. The insurance industry was also transformed by the disaster. The enormous claims from Titanic's sinking bankrupted several insurance companies and led to new approaches to risk assessment and coverage. The disaster demonstrated the need for better understanding of catastrophic risks and the importance of adequate reserves to cover major losses. The legal battles that followed the disaster were complex and protracted. Questions of jurisdiction, liability, and compensation were complicated by the international nature of the disaster and the various legal systems involved. The American courts were generally more generous to claimants than the British courts, leading to forum shopping and complex legal maneuvering. The disaster also raised important questions about corporate responsibility and the duty of care owed to passengers and crew. The White Star Line's defense that they had complied with all applicable regulations was challenged by arguments that they had a higher duty to ensure passenger safety. These debates helped establish important precedents for corporate liability in disaster situations. The media coverage of the disaster was unprecedented in its scope and intensity. The new technology of wireless communication allowed news of the disaster to spread around the world within hours, and newspapers competed fiercely for exclusive stories and photographs. The coverage established many of the patterns of modern disaster reporting, including the focus on human interest stories, the search for heroes and villains, and the detailed analysis of what went wrong. The disaster also marked a turning point in the relationship between technology and society. The early 20th century had been characterized by enormous confidence in technological progress and human mastery over nature. The sinking of the unsinkable ship challenged this confidence and introduced a note of caution and humility that would become more pronounced as the century progressed. The parallels between the Titanic disaster and other technological failures have been noted by historians and social scientists. The overconfidence in the ship's design and safety systems, the failure to heed warning signs, and the catastrophic consequences of system failure would be repeated in other disasters throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The disaster also highlighted the importance of human factors in technological systems. Despite all the advanced engineering and safety equipment, the disaster ultimately came down to human decisions and actions. The crew's training, the passengers' behavior, and the split-second decisions made during the emergency all played crucial roles in determining who lived and who died. The story of Titanic has been retold countless times in books, films, documentaries, and other media. Each retelling has emphasized different aspects of the story, reflecting the concerns and interests of different eras. Early accounts focused on heroism and sacrifice, while later versions have explored themes of class conflict, corporate responsibility, and technological hubris. The 1997 film, Titanic, directed by James Cameron, brought the story to a new generation and became one of the highest-grossing films of all time. The film's combination of historical drama and romantic fiction introduced millions of people to the story of the disaster and sparked renewed interest in the historical events. The discovery of the wreck in 1985 opened a new chapter in Titanic's story. The ability to explore the actual remains of the ship provided new insights into the disaster and allowed researchers to test various theories about what had happened. The images of the wreck, with its grand staircase collapsed and its hull split in two, provided a powerful visual reminder of the disaster's magnitude. The ongoing exploration of the wreck has also raised important questions about maritime archaeology and the preservation of underwater cultural heritage. The Titanic wreck is one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, but it is also deteriorating rapidly due to natural processes and human interference. The commercialization of the Titanic story has been controversial, with some arguing that the disaster should not be exploited for profit, while others maintain that commercial interest helps preserve the memory of the victims and the lessons of the disaster. The sale of artifacts recovered from the wreck has been particularly contentious, with critics arguing that items from the ship should not be treated as commodities. The Centennial of the disaster in 2012 prompted extensive reflection on the continuing relevance of the Titanic story. New research revealed additional details about the disaster, while commemorative events around the world honored the memory of those who died. The anniversary also provided an opportunity to assess how much maritime safety had improved in the centuries since the disaster. Modern cruise ships are vastly safer than Titanic was, with sophisticated radar and navigation systems, satellite communication, GPS positioning, and comprehensive safety equipment. The lessons learned from the Titanic disaster, along with other maritime accidents, have led to continuous improvements in ship design, safety procedures, and emergency response. However, the fundamental challenges of maritime safety remain. Ships still operate in dangerous environments, and the consequences of accidents can still be catastrophic. The Costa Concordia disaster in 2012, which occurred almost exactly 100 years after Titanic sank, demonstrated that modern ships are not immune to accidents and that human error remains a significant factor in maritime disasters. The environmental impact of the Titanic disaster has also gained attention in recent years. The ship's fuel oil and other pollutants were released into the ocean when she sank, though the environmental impact was relatively small compared to modern standards. The wreck itself has become an artificial reef, supporting marine life in the deep ocean environment. The ongoing deterioration of the wreck has raised questions about the long-term fate of the site. Scientists estimate that the ship's hull will eventually collapse completely, erasing one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. Efforts to preserve the wreck through documentation and artifact recovery have been controversial, but may be the only way to maintain a physical connection to the disaster. The story of Titanic continues to evolve as new research reveals additional details about the disaster and its aftermath. Recent studies have examined everything from the metallurgy of the ship's construction to the social dynamics of the evacuation, providing new insights into why the disaster occurred and how it unfolded. The human stories of the disaster remain the most compelling aspect of the Titanic legacy. The individual tales of courage and cowardice, love and loss, hope and despair continue to resonate with people around the world. These stories remind us that behind the statistics and technical details were real people with real lives, dreams, and fears. The disaster also serves as a reminder of the importance of preparedness and the need to learn from past mistakes. The improvements in maritime safety that followed the disaster have undoubtedly saved thousands of lives over the past century, demonstrating that tragedy can lead to positive change if the lessons are properly learned and applied. The story of Titanic is ultimately a story about the human condition, our aspirations and limitations, our capacity for both greatness and failure, our ability to create magnificent achievements, and our vulnerability to forces beyond our control. The ship was a symbol of human ambition and technological progress, but her fate reminds us that we are not masters of our destiny, and that nature still holds the ultimate power. The passengers and crew who sailed on Titanic's maiden voyage were ordinary people living extraordinary lives. They were pursuing their dreams, supporting their families, and working to build better futures for themselves and their loved ones. Their stories, both those who survived and those who perished, continue to inspire and instruct us more than a century later. The legacy of Titanic is not just about a ship that sank or a disaster that occurred, but about the enduring human spirit that can find hope and meaning even in the face of tragedy. The heroism displayed by so many during those terrible hours in April 1912 reminds us of the best of human nature, while the lessons learned from the disaster continue to make the world a safer place. As we remember the story of Titanic, we honor not just the memory of those who died, but the courage of those who lived, the dedication of those who served, and the resilience of those who survived. Their legacy lives on in the safety improvements that protect modern travelers, in the stories that continue to inspire new generations, and in the reminder that even in our darkest hours, the human spirit can shine brightest. The great ship may lie broken on the ocean floor, her lights forever extinguished, and her engines forever silent. But the story of Titanic, with all its tragedy and triumph, its lessons and its legacy, continues to sail on through the currents of human memory and imagination. And in that sense, perhaps the ship that was called unsinkable truly is, not in steel and iron, but in the enduring power of the human stories she carried and the lessons she left behind. In the end, the story of Titanic is our story, a reflection of our hopes and fears, our achievements and failures, our capacity for both greatness and folly. It reminds us to approach life with both ambition and humility, to prepare for the unexpected, to help our fellow travelers on life's journey, and to never forget that we are all passengers on the same fragile vessel, sailing together through the vast and sometimes dangerous ocean of existence. The band played on until the end, and in a way, it still plays on today, in every act of courage, every gesture of kindness, every effort to make the world a safer and better place. That, perhaps, is the true legacy of Titanic, not the tragedy of what was lost, but the inspiration of what endures.